Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Navigating the Identity Crisis, a data-driven analysis of IGA maturity, risks, and future roadmaps. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be moderating today's event. Our featured speaker is Ken Buckler, Research Director at EMA. Ken has over 15 years of industry experience as a noted information and cybersecurity practitioner, software developer, author, and presenter. Focusing on strict federal security standards, Ken has consulted with numerous federal organizations, including the Defense Information Systems Agency, Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Census Bureau. Before I hand things over to Ken, I wanted today's audience to know that Ken will be wrapping up his presentation today by taking your questions. Feel free to log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA later today that will include the on-demand playback as well as some additional resources. So be sure to check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Ken Buckler. Ken?
Hey, thanks, Raleigh. Really appreciate that fantastic introduction. And yeah, this has been a really interesting research project focused on identity and some of the challenges that people are having, uh, companies are having when it comes to managing those identities and governing those identities. And this research couldn't have been possible if it wasn't for Armada. So Armada is a leader in identity security and governance, helping organizations reduce risk by securing access for every identity, human and non-human. Armada's platform uses AI-driven insights and intelligent automation to enforce just-in-time, least privilege access. With unified visibility and continuous risk evaluation, Armada enables security teams to detect threats faster, strengthen control, and scale identity security without added complexity. So now, without further ado, let's dive into the research here a little bit. So, why identity governance? When I started off putting together this research concept, one of the things that I really wanted to explore is how are organizations governing identities? Because identity governance isn't a concept that is easy. It's not an easy concept to talk about because there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of integrations. But as you can see here, for the organizations that we surveyed, it's very important. You have to have that unified, that identity governance and administration, because if you don't, then you get a significant disparity between your accounts. So 86% said very important to their organization, and we really wanted to understand the current identity governance landscape, how organizations are using IGA, and their identity priorities and challenges. So let's jump into some of the highlights of the survey. One of the most interesting one is 53% of organizations now rank improving security posture as their single most important priority for IGA adoption. That's pretty important, I think, because if you look at traditional way of securing enterprises, a lot of it's been focused not on the identities but on the perimeter. But that's not the way that organizations work anymore in modern times, especially post COVID. There's a lot of distributed workforce, a lot of remote workforce. Personally, I'm working remotely right now, providing you this webinar. So it's really interesting to see that shift, and that has really moved a lot of the focus from the perimeter to the identities. High failure rates. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations are forced to abandon or scale back their zero trust or identity programs due to challenges. And we'll dive into that a little bit here shortly. Integration failures. As I said, IGA has a lot of moving parts. And that's actually one of the most difficult items for organizations implementing IGA is trying to get all those moving parts to work together. And then finally, there's the AI trust gap. And everybody talks about AI and how AI is going to revolutionize the future and make everything so much simpler and make everybody's jobs easier or maybe even replace people. But only 23% of organizations are even willing to trust AI to be fully agentic without any human involvement. So how do we overcome that? How do we move at the speed of cyber threats? Because if we don't use the AI to address cyber threats, we're going to fall behind because the attackers are using AI as well. So really interesting perspectives that came through this survey. Now we did ask some perspectives as far as their identity governance priorities, and there's some data that just simply can't be captured through multiple choice responses. So we said, okay, give us some details. And what I found really interesting is there's a lot of focus here on protecting corporate data and increasing their security posture. And it used to be that identity governance was a compliance exercise, not a security exercise. And it's encouraging to see that there's so many organizations out there now that are focusing on IGA as a security exercise, as not just a checkbox. So what's the current identity landscape look like when it comes to IGA? Well, this one kind of surprised me because if you've been around the industry for any length of time, you know that there's a huge push right now for cloud first. But right now, only we've got 48% of organizations are still using on-prem IGA solutions. That's amazing to me that we have so many organizations that are refusing to move off of on-premises. And in fact, we're looking at this. You actually see we have legacy on-prem that looks like it's probably migrating to modern on-prem solutions instead of SaaS or private cloud. So it's really interesting to see this transition. And organizations are hesitant to hand over the keys to the kingdom. They're hesitant to put those keys to the kingdom up in the cloud. So as I mentioned, remote work, that's really becoming an interesting challenge for sure. And it's been 65% of organizations are reporting challenges with that and being able to govern identities. And that's not surprising, especially when you have laptops that are going to be outside of the network perimeter. Maybe they're only connecting to Active Directory while they're connected to VPN. Maybe they haven't migrated to a Azure Active Directory, anything like that. So that increases your challenges. That makes IGA a lot more difficult. But we're also seeing a lot more security incidents at the same time. Almost 30% of respondents experienced an identity-involved incident in the last year. And this isn't surprising when you look at the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center statistics for 2024. Now, the 2025 statistics haven't been released yet, but in 2024, there was a 33% increase in cybercrime losses, financial losses due to cybercrime. That's huge. That's $16 billion lost due to an increase in cybercrime. The 2025 numbers should be released, I believe, in April. And I'm definitely going to be following up on that, and that'll be on a future webinar. So what's the identity governance priorities when it comes to managing these identities and trying to improve the posture of the enterprise? Well, role-based access plays a huge role, and this probably shouldn't be a surprise to anybody because for the longest time that's been the industry standard. And through role-based access, if we don't implement role-based access properly, then we're never going to be able to achieve any further, not compliance, but further security metrics like zero trust. So 93% of organizations, important or very important. No surprises here, but I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see it such strong, resounding, yes, we want role-based access. Principle of least privilege, which obviously is a critical concept in zero trust, 81% of organizations believe it reduces risk. Now, as a former cybersecurity practitioner myself, I agree with that 81%, obviously. The neutral ones, I understand skeptics. I'm a little concerned about the disagree and strongly disagree folks here. If you don't think least privilege is a critical concept in zero trust or that it reduces security risk, I'd love to hear from you on that. I would love to hear some disagreeing perspectives because it's just such a foreign concept to me that we're not going to reduce the risk by implementing principle of least privilege. That doesn't make sense to me. So if you're watching this and you disagree and you believe that zero trust does not reduce risk, the principle of least privilege does not reduce risk, please let's chat. I might even have you on a future podcast for Cybersecurity Awesomeness podcast. That'd be an interesting conversation. So as I mentioned, IGA is no longer just a compliance exercise. And, that's good because compliance should never be considered the finish line. Compliance should always be considered the starting line. It's not the end goal, it's where you start for your security gear. And it's really encouraging that over half of organizations now rank improving security posture as their top reason for implementing IGA. And what's really interesting is that only 15% said that simplifying compliance is the top reason. I suspect, now I haven't run previous surveys on this, but I suspect if you go back 5 years, you're going to see these numbers drastically different. So what kind of challenges are organizations seeing when it comes to IGA? Well, a significant number of organizations, 30%, have been forced to abandon or scale back their zero trust or identity programs due to persistent challenges. And, when we talked about some of those challenges, the main challenge is, of course, integration problems with getting all the moving parts to work together. And, there's a significant disconnect between the strategic intent and actual execution when it comes to IGA. This results in abandoning initiatives. And this can be not just frustrating to the IT department, but in fact, it can actually be catastrophic to the security of organizations. When you look at organizations that have had data breaches versus organizations that have not had data breach, 54% of organizations that had data breach in the past year involving an identity, I'm sorry, not 54, 56% scaled back their IGA or zero trust. Now, I don't believe that's a coincidence whatsoever. I absolutely believe that scaling back that IGA or zero trust program led to that data breach, most likely. So that's some startling numbers to me, and I thought that was really fascinating to see this correlation. So separation of duties, complexity of roles is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to implementing separation of duties. And I get that, I'm a former practitioner myself, and I've seen between database administrator, database auditor, database user, sometimes the lines get blurred on what those different roles are supposed to be able to do. And sometimes you have to blur those roles because if you don't, it breaks the applications. So complexity of roles is a serious issue. Lack of monitoring tools is a really interesting one to me. There are tools out there that do the monitoring, but 20% of people say lack of tools. That tells me either there's not enough market education on those tools' existence, or the tools are not working properly. Employee resistance, I get that one as well. Like I said, I'm a former practitioner. Nothing can be more stubborn than an employee that doesn't want to give up their permissions. One of the best examples there is probably employees not wanting to give up administrative access for their local workstation. Why don't they want to give up admin access? Because they want to be able to install applications on their own and not wait for the IT department. Well, there's solutions to that. There's solutions like self-service for application install where you set it up through your IT department, or there's a portal. So I think that what we're starting to see here is some of these challenges are bleeding over because of some of the legacy systems still in place. So how do we move forward? And as I mentioned before, AI is running rampant when it comes to threats. The threat actors are not hesitating to use AI to automate their own attacks. And I've seen this firsthand where the threat actors they'll put together their AI that will execute the attack, and if the AI doesn't work properly, oh well, they'll just fix it and try again. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury, because if we configure our AI incorrectly, that lets the attackers in. So organizations, they understand the importance of automating the identity governance process. And very few are even denying this. In fact, we didn't have anybody say it was unimportant whatsoever. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge because there's trust issues when it comes to AI. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at how critical the AI functionality is when it's managing these identities, you're giving the AI the keys to the kingdom. You are telling the AI, here you go. Here's everything in my enterprise. Don't screw it up. Well, that's no different than telling the brand new intern that you just hired, here's full admin access to the entire enterprise. Don't screw it up. Now, the intern is hopefully going to ask for permission before they make changes. But if you implement a fully agentic AI, the agentic AI, it's just going to take actions on its own. And we want that to happen, but we want it to happen safely. And it's going to become extremely important that we implement this in the future, because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to stay up to date with the AI-based threats that are out there. And even more importantly, because there's going to be so many AI agents in enterprises in the future, as enterprises continue to adopt AI, those identities associated with those agents, they need to be managed. The only way you're going to be able to do that at scale is going to be through automation. So here's the trust gap. And this is difficult gap to fill. It really is. So only 23% of organizations right now are willing to fully trust an agentic AI to manage identity decisions. Now, I get that, all right, and I have worked at federal agencies in the past. I'm not going to mention which one, but there was at one point in time where we get a phone call, all right, and it's like 4:30 in the afternoon. Everybody's getting ready to leave for the day. We get a phone call that the head of the civilian agency I worked for was at a conference getting ready to do a presentation, and they are locked out of their laptop. Now, I've never seen everybody else in my office scurry so fast to address a problem before. But that just goes to show that, okay, well, that was an issue where we knew the urgency of the problem. We went to fix it. What would happen if an agentic AI got involved? Would the agentic AI have just simply said, oh, well, we got to follow this process and blah, blah, blah. And the executive might not have made their presentation. So, but at the same time, what if somebody calls up that agentic AI, and the agentic AI understands the urgency, and somebody impersonates the executive and says, "Hey, I'm locked out of my email. I need access to my email right now." And the agentic AI just trusts that person to be who they say they are. So it's a very fine line that we have to walk. So I understand why it's only 23% that trust the agents. And in fact, I'm even surprised that the number is that high. We have a long way to go in this industry to establish that trust. And unfortunately, the only way we're going to be able to do that is through proper guardrails, is through proper training of the AIs. And yeah, it's gonna take a while to overcome this human in the loop oversight. But unfortunately, human in the loop is not going to scale. So what do we do? What are the success steps we need to take? Well, most importantly, don't let your tool dictate strategy. Critical finding, 47% of organizations lack a fully defined vendor agnostic framework. That's huge. We need to have vendor agnostic frameworks in order to move properly, because if you're relying on a specific vendor, all those moving parts aren't going to necessarily work together properly. We need to overcome the tool trap. We need to stop being relying on just one specific tool, because what happens if that vendor goes out of business tomorrow? We need to develop tools. We need to develop processes that are portable, that are going to survive replacement. And finally, success requires defining governance standards before selecting the technology. If you select the governance standards before selecting the technology, you're better positioned for success. So we're at a crossroads right now in the industry, especially when you consider all the agentic AI and all the interesting stuff that's happening. Just the past year alone has been huge with agentic AI boom. I'm getting ready to go to RSA conference here in about a month, and I know that agentic AI is going to be the entire topic for a significant part of the conference. I've accepted that, but we have to make sure that we do it in a proper manner. We do it in a secure manner. And I'm not talking about just using agentic AI to secure things, but making sure that agentic AI itself is secure. Legacy is going to result in failure, because legacy applications, unfortunately, do not have the ability to manage these agentic identities that are going to be becoming so proliferate. I think that's a word, proliferate. It's going to be very interesting to see. We're talking thousands of agentic identities per employee is the current predictions that I'm seeing for some of the business applications. So that's mind blowing when you think about how large the identity landscape is going to become, and how much your identity team, your IT team, your security team is going to have to do to keep up with it. At the same time, we're also seeing interesting shifts in that 59% of organizations are embracing modern systems, whether they be on-prem or in the cloud, to fix operational failures. So we're at a really exciting time in the industry when it comes to IGA, which is it's hard to believe that I'm actually saying that, because here I am, I'm a security nerd, and in the past IGA has just been viewed as a compliance exercise, but now it's grown its legs, and it's fully becoming an important part of the cybersecurity market. So we have to bridge that gap though between AI if we were going to continue to be successful. And AI is already here. And, it's not science fiction. A previous webinar, I believe I talked about 40% of organizations have already deployed agentic AI in production. And that number is just growing every day. The ultimate goal, we need to look at identity not as compliance checkbox, but as security enabler. We can't achieve zero trust unless we properly govern our identities. We can't achieve zero trust unless we properly govern the permissions for those identities. Zero trust needs to become a reality, not a buzzword. Now, zero trust is never fully obtainable. All right, and I'll be the first to admit that. Zero trust is a journey that never ends. But you have to start that journey somewhere, and locking down your identities with proper governance is the start of that journey. So ultimately, the data shows successful organizations are the ones transforming back office administrative tasks into proactive security enablers when it comes to identity. We have to establish vendor agnostic best practices first, embracing AI-driven automation. You can reduce risk by simultaneously unlocking the operational speed for your business. So I really hope this has been an insightful webinar. I know we've got a couple minutes here for questions, but I'll turn that over to Raleigh. Raleigh, what kind of questions we got?
Thanks, Ken. The first one is the data shows a stark correlation between legacy systems and program failure, yet organizations are still using on-prem solutions. What is the barrier stopping these companies from migrating to the cloud?
Well, I think it's important to realize that migrating to the cloud might not even be in the cards for some of these companies. And the reason for that isn't necessarily legacy systems, but it might be the design of their own applications. They may have applications that they simply can't transfer to the cloud. They can't migrate to the cloud. They have to keep on-prem. The other thing is it might also be a trust barrier as well. There will always be organizations that cannot migrate to the cloud, and that's okay. We need to stop pushing organizations migrate to this, migrate to that. We need to start meeting organizations where they are and where they want to go. So, good question.
Thanks, Ken. With the data showing that integration challenges are a top reason for failure, how does adding AI into the mix affect that complexity?
Well, it depends on how you implement it. If you just implement AI by itself and start adding in thousands upon thousands of AIs and agentic AIs, you're setting yourself up for failure. And you need to embrace standardization. One of the best options on that is model context protocol servers. This is a pretty new concept that's been in the works for probably over the past year or so by organizations. And these MCP servers, they help standardize some of the protocols and more importantly, creates a central point that hopefully you can secure. Now, I say that because at the same time, the MCP servers, they also introduce risk on their own, and you still need to lock those MCP servers down, especially the identities associated with those MCP servers. So, yep, another great question. What else we got?
You mentioned the significant trust gap where 85% of organizations rate AI as critical, yet only about 23% are willing to fully trust an agentic AI without intervention. How do organizations bridge this gap?
Well, the first step is absolutely going to be developing better models, developing models that we know we can trust. And then we need to make sure that those models are provable and that the vendors that are developing these models, they need to allow companies some time to get adjusted to this is how the AI models are going to operate in my environment and gradually phase out the human in the loop approach. The other important part of that is also guardrails. We need to put in specific guardrails, specific warnings in these models that, say, hey, don't ever do this, or if you see it starting to do this, something's wrong. Great example. Let's say for some reason, an agentic AI decides, oh, I need to lock out every single account in the enterprise because I think there's a threat. It should never, ever do that. And if it's starting to lock out every account in the enterprise, somebody has found a denial of service exploit and they're actually using it against AI. So that's the kind of things that we need to think about when we're developing these models and implementing these models. is putting in specific guardrails to ensure that the models don't damage the enterprise they're trying to protect.
Thanks, Ken. Let's take one final question. Do you think compliance is becoming less relevant, or is it just that security is now the easier way to get budget approval from the board?
Compliance will never become less relevant. I think it's important to note that compliance will always have its place because you're going to have to justify that to the board, whether that be HIPAA compliance or PCI compliance, GDPR, what have you. You always have to justify those compliance numbers. But it's also important to realize that compliance is a starting point, not an ending point. It's not the finish line. Compliance is viewed as the absolute bare minimum, but you need to harden your enterprise. You need to make your enterprises resilient. And that means going above and beyond just the basic compliance steps. So, fantastic question. I'm always happy to chat more about these kind of topics. So, please feel free to reach out to me through email, reach out to me through LinkedIn. And I'm really interested in hearing people's perspectives on this. And if you disagree with me on some of this stuff, cool. Let's talk about that too. I'd love to hear that. If you have an interesting enough perspective, I'll even bring you on the podcast, and we'll duke it out on the podcast because that'd make for some interesting conversations. So, no, this has been fantastic. Raleigh, thank you so much for all your help today moderating, and this has been a really good webinar. I appreciate everybody that's been watching.
Thanks, Ken, for all your great insights, and thanks to the audience for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. As I mentioned, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA, so check that email out, and I hope we'll see you at a future EMA research webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Raleigh.